This is what you've got in front of you, sort of 3-page short story, so if you haven't read it, you can catch up in one of the breaks. So to answer this question about what form and structure do in the short story, I'm going to be turning to the 3 lecturers I've just introduced to give you a sort of short introduction to the story based on their own research interests. But before I invite our first speaker, I would like to just introduce the story to make sure that we're all on the same page. So I want to begin with a picture. The painting that you can see on the screen, with its full title below, was painted by Leonard Rosenman in 1941. It's sometimes referred to as the Falling Wall, and in a way it tells the same story as the story that is printed on 3 pages in front of you. Now, you might ask how I know this, and it's a really good question. Why should a picture and a piece of writing tell the same story when they're by different people? And they have different titles too. So I'll summarise the plot of the Sansom short story. For those of you who know it, it's very simple. It's about 4 men, and in about the second paragraph you can see that they are Len, Lofty, Verno and myself, who were called to put out a fire in the middle of the Blitz at night in London. Now, as these 4 men fight the fire, something terrible happens, and the entire front of the building that is on fire falls away. It frames them in the story almost like a photograph does. As the story draws to its end, we hear that Lofty has been killed by the fall, and the other men have been dug out of the rubble. So the story, in some ways, is true. The men who were there included Sansom, the author of the story, and also Rosenman, the painter of this picture. There was also a 3rd man there who, like Lofty, was killed. So the picture quite literally does describe the same event as Sansom's The Wall. Before I hand over, I'd just like to draw your attention to a short passage at the end of the 2nd page of your handout. So I'm going to read this to you, and as I read it, I want you to think about how the painting imagines a similar scene. A wall will fall in many ways. It may sway over to the one side or the other. It may crumble at the very beginning of its fall. It may remain intact and fall flat. This wall fell as flat as a pancake. It clung to its shape through 90 degrees to the horizontal. Then it detached itself from the pivot and slammed down on top of us. So of course in the painting that you're looking at on the screen, the wall hasn't fallen. And though in the short story the wall may fall in lots of different ways, you'll note that that word may is repeated 3 times in only 2 or 3 lines. In the painting, the fall can only be represented once. So that's something to think about. But now I'll hand over to Dr. Ross Wilson, who's going to talk to you about his research and the wall.
Thanks very much, Claire. So I'm Ross Wilson, and I'm a lecturer in criticism in the English faculty. And I want to begin just by thinking what criticism really means. I spend an awful lot of time thinking about the different things that people write about writing. So how they go about doing that. And here I've listed some of them. I've put at the top here essays, of course, which you might be familiar with. Lots of people who want to write criticism write essays. They fill academic journals, Sunday papers. When you come to do your GCSEs and A-levels, you'll be forced to write them as well. We love essays so much here in Cambridge, we get our students to write at least one a week. So they're a really important form of writing about writing. But then I've listed here a number of different other kinds of writing about writing. So reviews, interviews and dialogues. You might think about the classes that you have this afternoon as being critical dialogues of a certain kind. Lectures and talks, perhaps a little bit like this one, selections and anthologies. So when people are choosing poems and short stories and so on to go in anthologies, they're performing the function of a critic in some ways. journals and diaries, autobiographies and biographies, of course. And then the thing that I want to talk about a little bit today, introductions, prologues and prefaces. Now, I've thought an awful lot about this form of criticism, in particular in relationship to this rather fun-looking chap. This is Henry James, who was one of the leading novelists and short story writers of the 19th century. He lived the latter part of his life in Rye, in Sussex, but was actually American by birth. And towards the end of his life, he prepared an edition of all of his works. He wanted it in particular to look rather splendid, and there it is. You can buy it for a fortune today, rather handsome-looking books there. This was very important to him. And what he also did was he prefaced each of those volumes with an introduction, with a preface, describing the origin of the individual novel or short story that was in that volume, telling us where he had the initial idea, how he developed it, and so on. And also really presenting his theory of the novel. So James's prefaces to the New York edition, as it has come to be called, is really one of the most important reflections on what a novel is, what the writer's life is, how people come to write and why they write, and so on. And in reading through James's prefaces, I've got to think that the preface is a very particular way of writing about the texts that it introduces. And I rather like this quotation from the Argentinian short story writer and novelist Jorge Luis Borges. And he says, "The preface is not an inferior kind of toast, but a sideways kind of criticism." What does he mean by that? So he means that the preface is not really just someone going, "Hey, look what a great guy this is who's written these stories, cheers." They're saying rather that it's a way of writing criticism that sits to one side of the text that it actually introduces. That's why it's a sideways kind of criticism. It comes at stories and novels from a particular kind of angle. So what's all of this got to do with the short story that you're reading, with The Wall by William Sansom? So this story was first published in a collection of Sansom's short stories. It was the first one, actually, to appear in that collection. You might want to think about that. Why would he want to put this first ahead of all his other short stories? And that collection has an introduction, not by Sansom, but by this woman, by Elizabeth Bowen, who was herself a very important novelist and short story writer, somewhat neglected up until recently, a modernist and innovative writer in all sorts of ways. This was the best picture of her I could find on the internet. Unfortunately for us, she's not reading the short stories of William Sansom. She's reading instead a book called Go Tell It on the Mountain by James Baldwin, very important mid-century American writer. So Bowen introduces these stories of Sansom. This is what her introduction looks like. So here just I point out that you've got the contents of the short stories, the end of the contents of the short stories on the left as you look. So that's a list of everything that Sansom has written. But then the first thing that you come to read on opening this book is actually by someone else. It's by Elizabeth Bowen, and she introduces these writers by Sansom, these writings by Sansom. Now, why would he want someone else to do that? Why would he want to speak in his own right? Well, possibly it's because Elizabeth Bowen is more famous, more respected, has higher kind of name recognition, we might say. And to get a kind of thumbs up from someone like her is really significant for someone like Sansom, who is less of those things, less famous and celebrated. Let's just have a look at this first paragraph of this introduction and what Bowen says here. So remember that I said that in James's prefaces, he offers us a kind of theory of the novel, of what it is to be a creative artist in some ways. And I think we can see Bowen doing that again here. Rare is the writer with command of his powers who absolutely cannot write a short story, if he so desire, or if, as may happen, it be desired of him. Few there must be who have not at one time or another wanted to try the hand at this form. So what she's basically saying there is, if you are a competent writer, if you know how to write, you can write a short story. And also, anyone who's practiced writing at some point is going to want to write in this form, is going to want to write short stories, okay? So in some senses, that's her theory of where short stories come from. But Sansom is different. So at the end of this paragraph, she differentiates Sansom from this regular run of okay, broadly competent writers who want to have a go at being a short story writer. And she says this: so those short stories written by competent writers, we do not feel that they were inevitable. In this, they differ essentially from stories by the short storyist par excellence, the short stories by birth, addiction, and destiny. Such is William Sansom. So here we have a theory of the short story, and then Sansom is different. He's an exemplary writer in this way. Now, this introduction goes on to sort of talk a little bit specifically about some of the stories to continue to try and show why Sansom is distinctive and worthy of our attention. But it ends with this statement of Bowen's. These are the final 3 short sentences of her introduction. The stories of William Sansom speak for themselves. A peril of introduction is that it can go on for too long. So this breaks off, though there could be more to say. And this might seem like the kind of thing that you would say you're being polite, you're going to, without much more ado, let's get over to William Sansom and so on. But actually, if you get your head into this, it's a bit kind of mind-bending, which is to say that she's just spent 3, 4, 5 pages introducing these stories, and then at the end says, but of course, ignore me, they speak for themselves, I'm going to shut up now. But then immediately having said that, says, oh, but of course there could be a lot more to say. Now this move, this feature of saying, oh, I've said too much now, I must be quiet, is actually one that's met with in this form of criticism, in the preface, with remarkable frequency. We can see someone else at it, T.S. Eliot, another very important modernist writer, when he's introducing a book called In Parenthesis, which is a very strange kind of prose, verse, memoir of the First World War by the Welsh writer David Jones. Eliot says this: a work of literary art which uses the language in a new way or for a new purpose does not call for many words from the introducer. All that one can say amounts only to pointing towards the book and affirming its importance and permanence as a work of art. The aim of the introducer should be to arouse the curiosity of a possible new reader. To attempt to explain in such a note as this is futile. Again, that is rather similar to what Bowen says. I haven't talked much about Sansom, about the wall. I've talked about these introductions. My colleagues, Louise, Joy, and Helen Thaventhiran, are going to talk about the wall. But as we know from Bowen and from Eliot, anything that they can say is actually beside the point. It's futile. This story speaks for itself. So actually don't bother listening to them at all. In fact, perhaps it is rather me that has gone on too long in this note on introductions, and it's me that should shut up now and hand over to someone who does actually have something to say about this story, and that is Louise Joy. Thank you.
Right, well, in my research and in my teaching, I'm interested in what happens when we look at the words on the page of a text. And what Ross has been doing in his talk, what Claire in a sense did by putting up the image outside of the text, is taking us away from the words on the page on the basis that we can understand something very important about those words by looking at material that relates to them or that might sit around them and bringing that to bear on the text. And I don't deny that that is a very useful and important activity. But my interest is in what happens when we turn into our own heads and think about what happens when we think about the relationship between what is in front of us and what is going on in our heads, in our bodies, while we are reading. It may initially seem that there's something quite easy about simply asking yourself some questions about what you're reading. After all, it saves a trip to the library, it saves that feeling of research. But I think there's something, in fact, very difficult about being honest with yourself about what is going on as you are undergoing the reading experience. If we closely chart the mental operations that the reader takes part in, while we are attempting to understand a text, we discover that we are constantly at work. We're constantly trying to solve problems. We may not even realise the extent of the effort that we are taking part in, or that is occurring to us. But what we are doing is undergoing critical work. We are doing something systematic. We're identifying problems, we're often posing a hypothesis, and we're collecting evidence, assessing this evidence in order to reach a judgment. But the judgments that you reach as a reader will necessarily be different in kind to those that anyone else will reach. And I think that's the extraordinary thing about criticism, the extraordinary thing about reading, that what happens to you is going to be different to something that has happened to any other human being who interacts with the same words on the page. And this is because the problems that you identify, the ideas you test out, and the evidence you can collect will all be different to those that other people come with. So no two readings are the same. And this is why, and I think this is quite a fundamental point, this is why thinking critically, reading critically, is an assertion of freedom. It's an enactment of your right to try out your questions, to see what happens when you interact with something outside of yourself, to experiment. And I would suggest that your experiments with your critical voices, in turn, secure the freedom of others. Because if we look to others, and we defer to others to find the answers to our questions, then we are not thinking for ourselves, and we are passing over the opportunity to be free. But we are also not holding other people to account. And by asking ourselves questions, we are constantly not only holding ourselves to account and taking responsibility for our own thoughts, but we are taking responsibility for others' thoughts by having something to challenge the thoughts of others with. We may never arrive at any fixed, definite, stable answers when we read something. In fact, why would we even seek to? Because we are constantly in flux, our minds are constantly in flux, time is constantly moving on. So even though the text might stand still on the page, what we see will shift around, what we feel will shift around. And so what we find will always be mobile, it's always a process, criticism. So I think it's helpful to think of criticism as something that is about happening, about being, about doing, and not about some kind of product. We don't look to determine some kind of answer. We enjoy the process of finding or searching. And this, for me, is where the pleasure resides. So, what kinds of questions might we ask of this text? Well, Claire already asked a question at the outset. She asked, what is this about? And she gave us a very useful summary of what she called the plot. That's to say, the key, the salient actions or lines of the story. But we might wonder whether a short story needs to be about anything. The very question implies that there might be something that we can take away from a text, maybe a message that we can glean and that we can learn. And I resist that idea. I feel uncomfortable with that idea. If it was as simple as that, then we might as well just write the message on a postcard and just record the message. Clearly, something greater than that is at work when we read a literary text, when we read a short story. And yet, unlike listening to, say, a piece of music or looking at an image such as the one we were looking at earlier, literary texts, because they comprise of language, and language has the capacity to mean something, it is a system of signs where we can convey meaning, it must mean that there is something to do with meaning in a literary text, that we can pick up something that we feel we have understood that we didn't understand before. So we can accept that a literary text will convey some kind of meaning, even if we don't want to root it, or we don't want to decide that the meaning will be singular or somehow readily summarizable. So let's return to that question, what is this short story about? Well, a really obvious place to start when we broach that question is the title. Titles do something before we even get to the rest of the words that will set up our expectations. At a surface glance, the title could hardly be more straightforward. The wall. We all know what a wall is. There's nothing mysterious about a wall. We see them all the time. We know that they go up. We know that they come down. So they already carry that sense of a narrative of something having been made by a human hand, and of course something that will be vulnerable to disintegration. They are familiar. We know that they have existed throughout time. But interestingly, the word that we might skim over in the title is actually the very invisible word there, the wall. Would this story have the same force if it had been called a wall, or simply wall? What effect does that the have on what we do with that title? Well, the particularises the wall. It's what we call a definite article. It gives us an idea that there is a particular instance of a wall that we are being asked to contemplate. And not only does that give us a sense of a geographical specificity, it also gives us a sense of a historical specificity. The wall at a given moment. It creates an idea that there's something unique about this wall, that it is not necessarily to be mistaken for other walls. This is not a story about fundamental philosophical questions about what it means to be a wall, though they may come into play. This is asking us to notice something about a particular example of a wall. And of course, a wall is an inanimate thing. A wall is something outside of ourselves, although, as I've suggested, we know that a wall can only be made on purpose by human hands. So there's already a sense of human presence in that inanimate object. But also we know that any short story must have a human presence by virtue of having been written. The fact of something being written and the fact of something being read means that human beings are involved in this activity. And so we know, even though the title doesn't spell it out, that the wall is of interest to us because of the relationships it implicitly poses between itself and human beings. It indicates that what our interest is something about the transaction between the inanimate object and the human being. So who is our subject? Who are the human beings in this story? Well, interestingly, the first mention of a human being is in the plural voice. It was our third job that night. Now, this is quite an unusual manoeuvre. Rather than foregrounding an individual, the story foregrounds a group of people. But it doesn't initially indicate who is included in that group, and of course who is excluded in that group. And when we hear the word our, it is impossible for us not to wonder about the extent to which we are included in that pronoun, because it is one that we do use to include ourselves. So we immediately have to make a judgment on reading that first line as to the extent to which we, the reader, operating at a different moment in time in a completely different geographical setting, are included in the human subject of this story. Now, later on in the story, we have a bit more specificity. We have a reference to Len, Lofty, Verno, and myself. And again, it's interesting that the order of that hour, that we, the breaking down of this we, places the me, the first person singular, at the end. It implies that the interest here is in the togetherness, the contact, in the shared experience, which of course is shared by virtue of the presence of the singular subject, but is not only of interest because it relates to the particular individual. But we also have other human presences in the poem. We do have an I voice. The I is never revealed. We don't know the name of this. We might infer from the fact that we have the author that there might be an autobiographical element to this first-person voice, but we would be being lazy if we assumed that necessarily that would be the case, because plenty of first-person voices in literary texts are fabrications or are versions of characters that may or may not have any resemblance to the author. One of the things that absolutely fascinates me about this story, though, is that the I voice is absolutely unstable. We have no sense of a constant moment in temporal moment. We flit between different versions of this subject position. By subject position, I mean the I voice. So if you have a look, for example, at the beginning of the third paragraph, we have, I suppose we were worn down and shivering. Now, I suppose is in the present tense, and yet we were worn down is in the past tense. So we already, within a space of a few words there, have a jostling of different versions of this I voice. We have one that is thinking right now and remembering what it felt like or what it was like to be, and they render it as a completed activity, worn down. And of course, to feel worn down, that is something that one knows by turning inside oneself and knowing, I feel exhausted. You can't necessarily know that someone else is feeling exhausted, and yet this subject is creating this as a plural and suggesting that there is a kind of collapse between the emotions and the state of mind of the individual and those that are being read by him that pertain to other people. So we have this interesting moving between these individual subjects, present and past, and the other human presences, the separateness. We're moving between the separateness of the self and breaking that down and suggesting that there's something that is inseparable about the presences in this story. If you look slightly later in the story, on the second page, in the middle we have the paragraph that begins 3 of the stories. And if you just look slightly further along in that paragraph, we have, whether the descending wall actually paused in its fall, I can never know. We have there a present deliberation, I can never know, a reflection on what it is impossible to determine in the present, about something that happened long, or we assume happened at some stage before, we don't know at how long before, the gap between experience and writing. And then we have, probably it never did. We have that sense, probably it only seems to hang there. Probably my eyes only digested its action at an early period of momentum. We have this sense of the present constantly attempting to revise or to pin down or to work out or work through something that happened in the past. And the act of reflection, the act of wondering is going on right now, both in the voice of the speaker rendered in the present, but of course, for us, the reader, it is happening right now as we receive the text. So we have there as well that other present tense, that presentness of the reading experience. And that presentness of the reading experience is evoked by another gesture that takes place in this story, the gesture to you. We have several references to the second person voice saying you. And that, of course, reaches out beyond those who experienced this particular moment to those who could never have experienced it, but are being asked to include themselves in what it might feel like, to try to imagine this, to try to know it, and perhaps to try to make sense of it. All of the questions that I've been asking so far revolve around what the text is doing, what the words are doing. But that question is inseparable from another question, which is, what are we doing with the words? What are we doing to them? What are the words doing to us? There is always an interplay going on between the text and the reader. And in a sense, and some critics have claimed that it is we who create the text, that the text doesn't really exist until we come along and do something with it. So if what this text is doing is noticing a moment of time, and demonstrating that this act of noticing is ongoing and unfinished and constantly being revised, then what is my relationship, what is your relationship with this act of noticing, with its ongoing and unfinished status? Well, the answers, of course, are personal. Mine will be different to yours will all be different to one another's, and yours will all be different to all the other readers who have encountered this text. Some of our responses will be cognitive. That's to say, they'll be to do with understanding. They'll be to do with the feeling of knowing something. So, having read this story, I feel I have understood something that I didn't know before. Something of what it is to be another person in a different time. A person in a different position to me. Somebody who lived through a different historical moment to one that I can access. Someone who lived through something that I can only access through traces like this. I may feel that I know this, but I think I ought to be suspicious of that feeling of knowledge, because of course I don't know anything. I just feel that I know it. And that the status of a literary text at giving us any knowledge is something that we might want to be very sceptical about. I feel I understand something. That's not the same as understanding it. But some of the responses we have won't be to do with understanding. They'll be to do with something more philosophical, something more mobile, something to do with asking questions. This text has given me a new way of framing certain fundamental questions. What is time? What is the effect of the past on the present? And perhaps more intriguingly, what is the effect of the present on the past? And equally importantly, and this is the thing that is often so hard to talk about, often so hard to capture, and something that critics, I think, often slightly hide from doing, the response that we have to this story will also be emotional. It will be something that in literary criticism we often call affective. That is to say, we have some kind of movement in our minds, in our bodies, that we recognise to be nothing to do with thought, but something to do with emotion. It might be hard to put our finger on this, and it may be subtle, and interestingly, it may be something that develops over time. Your emotional reaction to a text might be quite different in a few days' time, when you've had time for it to percolate, to how it might be occurring to you right now. But for me, one of the things that is emotional that I can chart in my reaction to this text is a feeling of dread. It stirs in me that primal fear that things can and that things do go wrong. They can go wrong at any time, and it could be any one of us gazing up at that suspended moment, waiting for something to come down on us. And that might be the same thing, it might be the war, it might be figurative, it might be something that relates to the idea of that primal fear of things falling down in on us. The story stirs that fear in me, and I think it doesn't make sense to me unless I am able to access something of what it feels like to be trapped in that state of terror. I think also the story leaves me with a tinge of guilt. I haven't been called on to fight a fire. My generation hasn't been called on to put our lives on hold in order to save the lives of other people. I can imagine what it might feel like to be in that position, but I know I can't know it unless called upon to do the same. And I have that sense of guilt that seeps into the gap between what I know to be my experience and what I know to be the experience of real other people who have lived and who do live right now elsewhere. But mixed in all of these feelings of dread and fear and terror and guilt, in all the unsettled status there, and perhaps even because of it, there's something else, and something that I and many people before me would simply want to call pleasure. I feel a strong and palpable sense of pleasure at the thrill of being forced to think and feel things that I haven't had to think and feel before. And I will put it to you, and I hope you, over the course of this day, will find that this is a pleasure that is made all the more intense by virtue of the hard work that goes into its experience. Thank you. So I'm now going to hand over to Helen.
Okay, so I'm Helen Thaventhiran, and I teach modern literature here. And I'm particularly interested in the sorts of very complex things that single words can do, the weird and wonderful ways they can carry their meanings. That's what we're going to talk about now, the words of the wall. And by the end of this short talk, I'm going to have made a very strange claim. And that claim is that when you read this short story by Sansom, you might want to think about Chinese words as well as English ones. So how are we going to get there? Your first thought is probably, what? This is surely a very, very English story. It's a realistic, hyper-realistic even depiction of a scene from the London Blitz. It's as real as the documentary film that Sansom appeared in 1943, a film called Fires Were Started, in which he played himself, a fireman and an off-duty fireman. You see him here playing the piano, playing songs with his other friends, the other firemen in the pub. So there's a scene in this film, Fires Were Started, which is very similar to the scene that you've been reading in the wall. So the firemen rush to a burning building, and one of the firemen says, "Poor blimey, that wall looks a bit dodgy. Hope when it goes the right way." So that's very much the sound of this short story too. Perhaps not quite so slangy, but the same sound of the London streets, the London pubs. It's fairly plain English. Or is it? Well, it certainly opens, as you'll see on your sheets, with one of the most unremarkable words in the English language. It opens with the word it. Other writers around the time that Sansom was writing, writers like Virginia Woolf, for example, were much more fancy with their words. So Virginia Woolf came up with a word so elaborate that no one else has yet used it. Feel free to try and weave it into your essays at some point if you can. But even the detectives at the Oxford English Dictionary haven't been able to find a single other person who's used this word that Woolf made up, and that word is scrolloping. So you see the illustrations, Woolf, 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 no one else. So lots of modernist writers, people at this time, made up words like that and were elaborate with their choice of words, but not Sansom. Sansom does not scrollop. He mostly chooses his words in this short story from a fairly plain stock of words we might all know and use. So when you read the story, you might find that you do need a dictionary by your side at some times. There are some quite technical words in there, or some fairly specific ones. So we get words like declivities and hemispherical. We get words like, if you see here, vermilion in bold, and tactile, again in bold. And you might want to go away and look those up. But at the same time, as you can see here, there are only 2 bold words there. The rest of the words I would expect that you would probably be familiar with. So most of the time, the strange words of this story are padded by very comfortably plain, familiar terms. Or are they familiar? Let's have a look now at what we think we know about some plain words. And for this, I'm going to need the help of a friend. And this, William Sansom, is my friend for this talk. He is a poet, or he was a poet and a critic. And he was writing around the same time as William Sansom. Please try and ignore the dodgy beard as you look at him. He's more serious than it might appear. So Sansom was really interested in verbal meaning. He wrote lots of books. You see his first book here, about how words work. And he had a theory that we could describe about 7 ways in which words, single words, could have very complex inner meanings. And he gave numbers to those different ways in which words might work to carry their meanings. And the first type he described, first type ambiguity, is a bit like verbal bling. It's a kind of more is more meaning type, where the more meanings you can pack into a word or you can pull out of it, the better. And then the 7th type of ambiguity at the other end of the spectrum is like a tug of war. So a word can carry 2 very strong but completely opposite meanings, and the word can be pulled apart in a strong tension, like people tugging at both ends of a rope. So can we see this at work in the wall? Does the wall have words that are first type ambiguities and 7th type? I think it does, and I'm going to take you through a few examples now. So let's take the word bulge for our first type ambiguity. You've probably noticed the word bulge because it's the only word in the story that bulges out in italics from the prose. So here we have the moment where it occurs, and then below it you have the first definition in the Oxford English Dictionary for the word bulge. And what we see is that the first sense of the word bulge is nautical. It's about what happens when a ship springs a leak. We might think that's not very relevant to a story about firefighters, but if we think to Sansom's biography, Sansom's father was a naval architect who helped build ships. And a lot of Sansom's stories use metaphors and images from naval architecture. So quite frequently when he's talking about the hoses and the vehicles of the firefighters, he compares them to parts of a ship. So this sense of bulge, this nautical sense, probably goes in. But then the second sense of bulge, what's going on there? Well, we see it's illustrated in the dictionary by somebody talking about walls. So a bulge, for something to bulge, is for something to swell out in a faulty manner. For example, as of a wall in which the surface projects beyond the top and the bottom. So a wall is something that can bulge. But for Sansom, there's a very particular type of wall that might bulge. And if you think that the 1940s was not only the time of World War and the Blitz, it was also the heyday of Technicolor full-length Disney films. So in the 40s we get Dumbo the First, we get Bambi, we get Pinocchio, we get Fantasia, as you see up here. And Sansom, when he thinks about walls that bulge, thinks about Disney cartoons. So there's another short story again about burning buildings from 1946, and you see a quote from it here. It's a story called Building Alive, and Sansom says, "The wall, like a rubber wall in a Disney cartoon, sprang out at my eyes, bulging round, then snapped back to its flat self." So one of the ways in which Sansom is thinking about the word bulge, when he applies it to a wall, is informed by these new technologies of seeing animation on the screen, of going to the cinema and seeing Disney. So those are some historical ways, biographical and contextual, in which you can make sense of the word bulge for the story. Another sense of bulge which might push its way in is the military sense. We're talking about a war story after all. So if you think about bulge as a story, as a word for what happens when a military line bulges, you might think about the Battle of the Bulge. So the last major German offensive in World War II was called the Battle of the Bulge. Now that's not a possible meaning for this story written in 1941. Sansom can't be thinking when he writes his bulge about the Battle of the Bulge because it hasn't happened yet. So do we have to keep that sense to one side? Well, if we think back to Empson and verbal bling, more is more. Everything that comes into your experience of a word when you read it is part of the meaning of that word when we're thinking about first type ambiguity. Not in all cases, but there it matters. So we can keep bulge in the military sense, Battle of the Bulge, in the way we read that story too. So that's bulge and first type ambiguity, but what does all this have to do with my strange opening claim that the words in this story might also have something to do with complex Chinese words as well as English ones? Well, the wall is certainly from a time when lots of writers were experimenting with global made-up languages. It's a big time for Esperanto and for another made-up global language called Basic English. And these made-up composite languages were heavily promoted by governments and writers seeking to find ways to talk to each other across the world to try and end World War. So there's a context for international and composite languages for this story. But why bring in Chinese? To think about that, we again need the help of William Sansom and his interesting beard, because William Sansom didn't just find ambiguity in words, he also found it in faces. He travelled very extensively around Asia in the 1930s, and as he went, he collected as many types of Buddha faces as he could manage. And he started to notice a pattern in those faces. It's a pattern you might just be able to see here, although it takes a bit of a trained eye, so don't worry if it doesn't seem apparent. But the pattern he spotted was that Buddha faces are always ambiguous. They're in a kind of tug-of-war tension where one side, the left side, is calm and detached, and the right side is active and worldly. And this is something which has been confirmed by art historians, so it's probably sort of true. So he came up with this theory, wrote a whole book about it called Face of the Buddha, and then lost his book in a London taxi during the Blitz, and it was only discovered a few years ago. So after his death, it was published, and it gave us a sense of how, when we read a writer like Emerson, or when we read a writer like Sansom, we might initially think they're very English, they're very of our local world. But in fact, we sometimes have to travel quite far to understand all that they might bring to our sense of words and how they work. Because Sansom also engaged very much with Buddhist thought, and also Taoist thought. So he explained his short stories as, this is a quote from him, attempts to express in Western terms certain Buddhist philosophies. And then he went on to say that the sage Laozi, who was associated with the parallel religion and philosophy Taoism, Laozi engrosses me. So when he's writing a short story like The Wall, he's trying to find a way of bringing certain Chinese concepts and certain Buddhist and Taoist philosophies through into his English forms. So one form that's important for Sansom is one that we discover in Laozi's The Book of the Way. And that's the form that you see here in these Chinese ideograms. So that's the word wu wei. And that word means not acting, in exertion, not doing. So if we think about Sansom's story, The Wall, in those terms, then we see that it's a good kind of explanatory word for that story. Because throughout the whole story, we've got this pattern of extreme action, vitality, and extreme stasis, doing nothing in exertion. So there are various ways in which Sansom makes this happen in a linguistic sense. So one is that he's always turning his nouns into verbs. I've given you an example there, a needle of water fountained from a hole. And another way in which he packs the story with a kind of tense inactivity is by bursting it to the seams with all sorts of compounds. He's always making compounds by putting words together. So the story feels very bustling. And then a third way is by choosing some single words which look quite simple, but when you look at them perhaps in the dictionary or under your critical microscope, turn out to be quite double and quite complex, and often tell us a bit about this pull between action and inaction. And I've given you a list of the sorts of words you might look up to see that going on. And it's the last word on that list, digested, which I'll look at to finish now. So if we have bulge as first type ambiguity, I'm going to suggest that digested might be your seventh type ambiguity word, your tug of war word. So when you first hear the word or read the word digested, you probably, especially as we head towards lunchtime, think about your stomachs. You think about food going through your bodies. But if you have a look at the dictionary, you'll find that digested also means what goes on in your minds. So digested is a word for thought processes. It's what the mind does. A mind digesting is a mind thinking systematically, ordering things, dividing them, putting them in their places. So it's a tug of war or a seventh type ambiguity word because it's telling us about the basic ways bodies work, and it's telling us about the complex ways minds work at the same time. But what you might not see until you look at the word in the dictionary is that there are quite a lot of senses of digest or digested which have to do with the effect of heat on bodies. This wasn't something I knew till I double-checked it in the dictionary, but senses 8, 9 and 10 in the dictionary list are all about what happens to a body with the effect of heat. So digested is probably the ultimate word for this short story, because if you think about this burning wall that's about to fall on a body with the immense effect of its heat, and if you think about that body standing very, very still in this state of inactivity, this Chinese state of wu wei, that body is also very busy inside. There's a very busy process of digesting fear, and there's a mental process of digesting the action or the possible inaction. So digested is an equivalent word to wu wei, and it sums up a lot of what's going on with this short story. So if we think about words in these ways, then it helps us to understand the history of English words and how they might inform how a short story writer goes about making a story powerful. But it might also push us out in more global directions to think about how words don't just belong to one language and stories often belong to more places than we can first see. So if you get out your critical microscopes and your dictionaries and hold them over, just the words, the tiny words and the tiniest units of stories, then it's often possible to start to see a whole world. Okay, so I'm going to hand back to Claire now. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for listening to those 3 lectures, and I hope that's given you lots of ideas about the different ways that you can read a short story, probably in some quite surprising ways as well. So what we're going to do now, I'm going to give you 2 minutes, and I'd just like you to sort of make small groups. You don't need to move. And I'd like each group to think of a question. Now, you won't necessarily be asking these questions. I'm not going to put anyone on the spot, but we would like to have some questions from you. So if you could take sort of 2-3 minutes to confer and think about what you would like to know about the war. Now, this might be in relation to the story, or it might be in relation to what you've just heard. So have a think, and we'll group back together in a moment.